In today's interview, I talked with Dr. Jonathan Newton, and we talked about how to learn languages and on your own, or maybe using tutors, for example. So, Dr. Jonathan Newton is an associate professor in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington, and he's the program director for the Master of Applied Linguistics. We talked about a bunch of things, namely the gap between language study and language use. We also talked about using tutors for learning languages. We talked about input. Is input sufficient to learn languages, or do you need to do something else? We talked about the importance of vocabulary for language, future uses of artificial intelligence for learning languages, and much more. I hope that you enjoyed this interview. So, Jonathan, could you introduce yourself to people, and keep in mind that my listeners are mostly just, average people trying to learn languages, whether it be in a classroom or on their own.
Yeah, sure. My name's Jonathan Newton. I work at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. I've been involved in language teaching since the 19s. I began my career in China, teaching at a university without any prior experience. Sort of had to learn on the job, so to speak, and really was excited by that experience and wanted to know more, so came back to New Zealand to get a postgraduate diploma in language teaching, with the intention of going back to China to keep teaching. But, life caught up on me and took me in different directions, and I'm still here. But I've spent a lot of time in the last 30 years working in Asia, in and out of Asia, working with language teachers in Malaysia, China, and Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Japan. So I'm always interested in getting alongside teachers in different contexts and finding out what they do, why they do it, how they do it, and learning from them, and then sharing those ideas back with other teachers. So yeah, that's me, and I'm really interested in teachers and teaching.
Right, and so we're talking specifically about language teaching. So I suppose the end goal would be optimizing how teachers teach in the classroom so that students can learn as much as possible. Is that correct?
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so I think among my listeners, what I've been able to see is that a lot of people learn languages on their own, but there are also a lot of people who are wondering, well, okay, maybe it's better for me to actually take a class or, go to college or something like that to learn a language. And so I guess my first question to get started would be for people who want to learn a language and they want to do it the more, let's say, formal way with textbooks and in a classroom, not on your own, what would you recommend that they do?
Let me pull back a bit from that question and just reflect on the difference between learning by yourself and learning in a collaborative context with other learners, and perhaps with a teacher guiding you. In my own experience, I'm actually currently learning French through Duolingo, just as a kind of, so that I've always got the experience of learning another language while I talk to teachers about languages. And I find that after a couple of years of, every day studying a little bit of French, if I try to say anything in French or have a conversation in French, I'm just completely lost, because the mode of my study doesn't reflect the mode of my use of the language. So I'm studying it, but then the use is some kind of live communication, which involves identity and ego and communicative needs and all these kind of things. And, there's a really simple principle from psychology called transfer appropriate processing. It sounds a bit abstract, TAP, transfer appropriate processing. And it means that the mode in which you practice is the mode in which you will be able to perform. So and I think this is, even if you're a learner learning by yourself and you're studying grammar and exercise books and doing a lot of listening, and then you think, how come I've put all these hours into studying the language, and then I try to use it, and I feel like I've learned nothing, right? It's because the study mode doesn't reflect the use mode. I mean, you can, if there are any parents watching this who are guiding their kids, their students, their kids or children at school, and it's the same principle. I had my daughter, when she was studying for school, she would be studying for exams by reading. And I would say to her, so what do you do in the exam? Do you read? And she says, no, of course not. I write. I said, okay, well, if you want to study for the exam, you've got to write. And it's the same with language learning. Sure, vocab flashcards and and grammar study and so forth are all great, but they're preliminary. You've got to build into your practice sort of active modes of use. And it's such a truism. It's so obvious. And yet, I think it speaks to the experience of many learners. They find such a huge gap between the investment they put into study and their capacity to use what they've studied. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my worry in the beginning, especially when you're getting started with a language, is if you talk a lot, or, well, I guess you're not talking a lot if you're doing these activities, you're asking the tutor to be a conversation partner and sort of fill in the gaps. But wouldn't you have too many opportunities to make mistakes? And then I forgot what the term is. I talked about this with Bill Van Patten, something called fossilization or some
Fossilization, yeah, or
fossilization.
stabilization. It's called stabilization these days because the metaphor of a fossil is kind of is negative for language learners. It feels like it's hard as rock and you can't change the mistakes. So
Right, it definitely
fossilization,
feels that
yeah.
way. Yeah, yeah. So stabilization, and I suppose my question is, this has always been a concern of mine. And essentially, when I asked a question about stabilization with Bill Van Patten, he essentially responded that it's not necessarily a real thing in the sense that it may be the case that people keep making the same mistakes over time just because they don't really care. Essentially, they don't, they're able to communicate, and that's fine for them. What is your opinion on this, on stabilization, and is this a real concern in the classroom but also for language learners?
I think it's people are overly concerned with it, and I think there's a confusion here or a lack of understanding about the balance of accuracy, fluency, and complexity. And the stabilization issue, I mean, it's a real issue, but it's an issue of accuracy and it neglects. If people are overly concerned with accuracy, they're not going to get opportunities for fluency development. So the kind of conversation that we're talking about is where, look, if it's one-to-one, it's low stakes, you're my tutor, I can make as many mistakes as I like, I'm just going to try and start using the language. I'm going to try and get the language into my mouth and out of my mouth. And I'm going to struggle and my pronunciation is going to be awful. And I'm going to use terrible language. But I've got to break the barrier of getting that language lubricated in my productive facilities, right? Now, alongside that, when I'm outside of the one-to-one tutoring system, I'm going to be working with a grammar book. I'm going to be, doing some reading where I'm seeing standardized language. So that's where I'm getting the accuracy and the standardization. And after a few sessions with the tutor can start giving me a little bit of more feedback. Okay, here's something you can say here, or here's a way you can pay attention to your pronunciation. But I think the real danger here is that you have a session where you're trying to communicate, and the tutor keeps on correcting every mistake you make. Well, what's the consequence of that? You're not going to come back. It's just accuracy, complexity, fluency. So opportunities for fluency development, and this is where the learner's identity, emotions, ego, well-being are all kind of compounded with language, where they struggle to use the language. If I was to use French with you now, it would be completely embarrassing. I would be absolutely humbled by the experience, and you would be listening to me and thinking, my God, this guy's hopeless, right? So if I'm going to be in a situation where I can just start to use my language with a French speaker such as yourself, I need to know that you're going to support me and put up with my mistakes and just assist me and guide me and give me a little bit of guidance and help me where the mistakes are causing a communication breakdown. But I need to be in a situation where I'm feeling safe to be able to take that risk. Once I'm safe, the emotional, affective, anxiety barriers start to come down. And once they're down, I can really start using my linguistic resources more effectively. I've got a bit more space in my head, in my mind, to pay attention to the mistakes because I'm not so worried about being an idiot. So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely noticed that for successful language learners, one of the things that I've observed is that these people are not necessarily very afraid of making mistakes, and they just, talk and write and try to
Yeah.
communicate, and then at some point things just work. You mentioned that for the accuracy part, you can use, textbooks and stuff like that. This is something I want to talk about because to me, at least from, I'm not an academic, but I'm seeing this from the average Joe's perspective. It seems to me like in academia, in the field of, let's say, just, second language acquisition, vocabulary, and all this language learning related fields, there are two types of opinions. So I'm talking specifically about, I tried to get Stephen Krashen on to do an interview, and I'm sure you're aware of his opinions on, it's all about input, and essentially nothing else matters, or it's really just a low return on your time. I had Bill Van Patten, sort of the same opinion. I'm going to interview Jeff McQuillan next month.
Mm.
And so there's it's all about input, people, and then there are people who are, like yourself, like Paul Nation, where it's like, input is great, but then at the same time there are lots of deliberate learning activities that you can do that are proven to work. So I'm really confused because, people on both sides seem like, very well educated in the field. So why do you think there's this divide here?
Oh, well, yeah, the field has been wrestling with that question for 85. Krashen wrote his input hypothesis, I think. So what is that, 40 years ago? 40 years we've been struggling with this question. I think Krashen's claims for the sufficiency of input are problematic, but no theory of second language acquisition doesn't avail itself of input as a powerful explanatory factor. Input is necessary without a question. Whether it's sufficient, which is, I think, I don't want to put words in Krashen's mouth, but I think he would argue for the sufficiency of input. And others have a more nuanced, perhaps, perspective on that, arguing that it's input plus opportunities to notice the grammar and pay deliberate attention to the grammar, which Paul Nation would argue for in relation to his four strands principle. From my perspective, as a proponent of task-based language teaching, I support the idea of getting learners to put language to use, whether it's listening or speaking or interacting, whatever, and building attention to grammar and vocabulary and forms of the language into that process of doing a task of some. It reminds me of something that Lightbound and Sparta, I don't know if you come across Lightbound and Sparta, two very famous Canadian scholars in the field whose book, I think it's called How Languages Are Learned, one of the classic undergraduate texts in SLA. And they talk about the two options for language teaching or learning, of get it right in the beginning, option 1, or get it right at the end, option 2. Option 1, get it right at the beginning, is reflected in approaches like audiolingualism, grammar translation, where the focus is on making sure everything the learners produce in the language is accurate from the beginning. Train them in understanding the rules and the grammar, rehearse it, drill it, so that you've eliminated the risk of mistakes, with the assumption that they will then go on to use the language accurately from then on. But all the research shows that that's a fairly dismal failure. And all that does is produce learners who have a vast knowledge of the language, but an inability to put that knowledge to use. Not least because I guess they're so anxious about making mistakes, because they've been drilled into not making mistakes and getting it right. So I think the approach that I support, and I think that is reflected in TBLT, to some extent reflected in Krashen's ideas, I think probably reflected in Bill Van Patten's ideas, is that you provide opportunities to pay attention to linguistic features before, during, and after the meaningful activities that you engage learners in. Now, in Bill Van Patten's input processing approach, right, the learners do have some strategy. I think that's referred to as strategy training to begin with, where they're given some cues about, okay, you're going to listen to a passage. Here's the particular linguistic feature you need to watch out for. Now we're going to listen to it, and you're going to extract the meaning from the passage. But in order to extract meaning, to do an activity in which you're making sense of it, you have to listen for those particular features.
Right, right.
So you're tuned into the particular learnable features in the input, but primarily it's for the purpose of making sense of the input. So it's still being driven largely by a meaning message extraction process, and then can be followed up by a bit further diagnostic reflection on, well, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? What have I learned? What's the rule? So you're kind of doing some conscious reflection. But the heart of that learning process is using language meaningfully. And even, from Krashen's perspective, just lots of comprehensible input. But it's comprehensible input with additional opportunities to learn.
Yes.
I think of this, Peter Skean, a wonderful, very influential British applied linguist, talks about the idea of nurturing noticing. Nurturing noticing. And I like that phrase. I think he has an article, which that is the title. And what he means by that is that we need to give our learners lots of opportunities to listen. Or if you're, sorry, I'm thinking from a teacher's perspective, but if you're just, learning yourself from input or from whatever it might be, watching movies, listening to text, reading simple novels in the language or whatever, that's great. But he argues that there needs to be opportunities to nurture the process of noticing learnable features. So you're thinking beforehand about what features do I expect to find in this text? What do I notice, for example, about how tenses are marked or the structure of adverbial clauses in the language? So you're kind of just, you're reading for meaning or you're listening for meaning, but you're also you've got your antennae turned on to notice things about it. And at the end of the process, then you do perhaps some deliberate conscious reflection on some of the features that you learned. I mean, I'm just reminded in saying this of Duolingo that I think in that program they encourage you that if you've done a lesson or two, don't just turn off the tape and go away and forget about it. But after that, spend a bit of time, maybe make a few notes where you just recall what have I learned in this lesson. So you're adding value to the process of engaging with.
Right. Yeah. This is very interesting because I never really thought about it this way. So it's augmented input, let's say. And so when you say noticing, and it's funny because I had another interview with a girl who's pretty successful, a Russian speaker who learned English, and we just happened to talk about noticing without knowing that necessarily it's a whole topic in the research. So when you say noticing features of the language, so we're talking about, for example, certain grammatical features, but also vocabulary, right? The way that words are used and so on, right? Okay. I wanted to ask this question. I also asked this question with Paul Nation, but he admitted that he's probably a little bit biased because his area of expertise is vocabulary, but my experience has been learning English, now learning Japanese. I'm learning a little bit of Italian, so it's on the back burner. But the main obstacle for me has always been vocabulary. The grammar, the pronunciation, listening. This is somewhat manageable manage these things. But vocabulary, it just seems like there are thousands, tens of thousands of words that I need to master to really be proficient in the language. Would you agree with this, that vocabulary is really the main obstacle for language learners?
Yes, I think there's been far too much of an emphasis on grammar traditionally, and vocabulary has very often taken second fiddle, and yet, as you've pointed out, actually what's the first violin, and it's actually first violin in the orchestra. Vocabulary drives language proficiency forwards. I'm going to say something else about that. The thought has slipped my mind. Carry on. Is there something else you want to?
Yes. So given that vocabulary is the main obstacle, then it would make sense to spend more time thinking about how to acquire vocabulary a lot faster and a lot better. We talked about flashcards with Paul Nation, which apparently there's a lot of research on. Are there activities that you would recommend for people in the classroom and outside of the classroom for vocabulary?
Yes. Let me just go back to the thought that I had before that I was holding in the back of my mind that I didn't quite finish. So I'll come back to that question. I want to go back to nurturing noticing just for a minute because I feel like I didn't quite wrap that up. And I want to just kind of draw together a link between the study a learner might do of the language, of linguistic forms, of vocabulary, for example, or grammar. So they might study it, and then they might struggle with understanding why can I not immediately use what I've studied. And I think the reason is that our study of language, our explicit, deliberate study of rules and structures and new words is valuable, but it often has an indirect route to learning. And what I mean by that is, particularly with grammar, we might study the grammar, but in order for that study to be integrated into our productive language system, we have to see that particular feature many times in input. We have to be processing it so that our language processor, and this is, I'm sure Krashen would be happy with this, our linguistic processor has to be just processing that particular feature lots of times so it starts to get integrated into our usable, implicit knowledge of the language. And so I think that if learners are wondering, what is the role of explicit study of language? I think the role is that it helps you notice the features in the input, right? So when you're reading and listening, the explicit study gives you a kind of a handle on some of those linguistic structures you're meeting while you're reading for meaning or listening for meaning. So that's just I wanted just to wrap that thought up. And I think that again is where I would part company with Krashen, because I'm arguing there for a really valuable role for explicit learning alongside implicit learning. Now that's true for grammar, but now we come to vocabulary, and it's a slightly different case because vocabulary doesn't function cognitively like grammar. Grammar is a generative system where you've got this sort of abstract rule, but whereas vocabulary is, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's more of a one-to-one correspondence. Here's a word, here's what it means. But of course, it's much more than that because words mean different things and they're used in different contexts and in different ways. But now coming back to your question, let me just try and rephrase your question and you can then shoot it back to me if I've got it wrong. You're asking me, how can learners rapidly build their vocabulary given how important it is and given how much there is to learn?
Yes.
For this, I think you can turn to pretty much anything that Paul Nation's written and find the answers. And there's lots of his material online. But Paul argues that, start with the high-frequency vocabulary. So start with the words that you're going to see a lot. Learn them quickly and directly and deliberately using flashcards or lists. Make sure that you, at the same time, are doing a lot of reading and listening of material that is simple so that you see those words in real text. And I think the important point there is simple. Many learners that I work with, I'm amazed at the fact that they engage, they're watching movies or TV shows or reading books that are written for advanced speakers or native speakers and struggling. And the problem with that is that they simply aren't engaging in the authentic process of reading or listening for meaning, because every fifth word is a word they have to stop and think about or look up, or they're going to go back and think about the grammar. And that's not really, that's valuable in its own right, but that's not going to give you the extensive input that you need. I think Paul's probably done some calculations around this, but if you think of the number of words you can process in 10 minutes of reading, and then you multiply that by 365 days of a year. Say you read for 10 minutes in the language every day. I'm not sure how many words you can read in 10 minutes in a second language. If it's a difficult piece of text, you won't be reading very many and you won't be understanding very much. But if you can find graded readers or simple reading material that is at a level where you can read a whole page and maybe only come across 3 words that you don't. So you need to be able to read that kind of material every day for a short period of time. And then just think in your head, how many words is my brain actually processing? And it'll turn out to be tens of thousands in a relative. If we think of a page containing, let's say 300 words, and let's say you can read 10 pages. If you're of a simplified book in 10 minutes, maybe we need 15 minutes, but let's say it's 10 pages. That's 3,000 words a day. 3,000 words a day times 365. I'm not going to do the multiplication online, but that's an awful lot of linguistic processing. From a usage-based perspective on second language acquisition now, which is, I think, a well-regarded theoretical perspective on how we acquire language through massive usage, through massive exposure to massive amounts of input and use. I think that is achieving a really important goal, or it's providing a very important mechanism for us to achieve the goal of acquiring fluency in the language. I'm going to go online, I'm going to find the simple material, I'm going to get the word lists, I'm going to make sure I know the first 3,000, 4,000, 3,000 words of English or French or whatever it is first. And then on that basis, think when you come across the other words, increasingly you will have enough context around them, around those words, to make sense of them more easily. Now, it's not always that simple, but when you know the first 3,000, 4,000 words of a language, you know 85% of the words you're going to meet on a random page of text. And that other 15% is made up of the other 90,000 words in the language, which you haven't got a hope in hell of learning.
Yeah, it's that's been my experience as well. Learning English seems it's so strange because the beginning it's a very slow start. You just learn the language, and the most important words, you start to learn them. It's a very slow process, but the more you learn, the faster you can make connections with other words and stuff like that. And so it seems almost exponential, the growth. This is something I've definitely been thinking about lately, because I do make flashcard decks, and so they contain the 10,000 most common words in multiple languages. But I wanted to get your opinion on, obviously this is somewhat of a trendy topic, but artificial intelligence. Probably up to 6 months ago, I didn't really pay attention to all the hype around artificial intelligence. But then I started using ChatGPT, and specifically, obviously, writing, and they have this new model where you can talk to the app and it actually talks back with stuff that is very relevant and on point. Although I have noticed, because I'm using it for Japanese, where I talk in Japanese with ChatGPT and it talks back in perfect Japanese, except that it has a slight English accent, which is a little bit strange. But do you see this having any future in the classroom for language learners?
I think it has an application everywhere. So I've used Gemini, in fact, in my case, to generate simple conversations in French. I just say, look, give me a 200-word conversation in simple French about the weather. Okay, about a couple of people in Paris talking about the weather. All right, so and please, use the most frequent, low frequency or high frequency words in French.
Right.
So it's an easy, and then I can read it, I can listen to it, just play around with it, look at the linguistic features of it. So that's a very simple way of using ChatGPT, and that's kind of non-interactive. But you're right, you can also actually use it as a conversational partner. So you can use a chat bot to do all sorts of interactive things, and I think that's going to be just increasing in potentiality, just month by month in the future. So implications for the classroom. Just about every conference I go to, AI is a theme, and they're asking this question. And you're right. 6 months ago, people were talking about it, or maybe a year ago, talking about it in the future. And now we're right in the middle of it, and we're looking at what it can offer, what it's already offering, and what it's likely to offer 2, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years. Perhaps it's wishful thinking, but most of the people that I've talked to in this area are hopeful that teachers will still have a role in, if you like, humanizing language learning, and they will have a role because classrooms will still have a role, that we will still want to get together with other people and engage face-to-face, whether it's face-to-face virtually or better, face-to-face physically. What roles? Almost any aspect of language teaching you can think about, AI has a role. Generating input, generating flashcards, generating opportunities to speak, giving you feedback on your speaking. As a teacher, designing lessons. So ask ChatGPT, I've got a lesson today with a beginner class of English language learners, and I would like you to design a lesson on family life. I'd like the lesson to last for about 50 minutes. I'd like it to have a simple reading and listening text, some pictures, and some pair work activities. And you have to learn to give, as you know, AI the right kind of prompts. Yeah, it'll give you the lesson, print it off, or drop it into your PowerPoints, and away you go.
Yeah, I suppose my concern.
Sorry, just let me interrupt. I'm just going to sit down here. So if you see weird things happening, I'm just going to.
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh, myself, I've got a stand-up desk, which is okay.
Nice. I've been meaning to. I want to get one of these, but yeah, with the computer, it's a little bit complicated.
Hey guys, just a 30-second break here from the interview, then we'll go back to the interview. I just want to make a deal with you. If you're enjoying this episode, if you're enjoying all my interviews, I want to make a deal with you. I'm going to continue to put much more effort, even more effort, into booking the best guests that I can, and getting as many of them as possible. But in exchange, what I'm asking of you is very simple. Please, if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And this costs nothing for you. And for me, this is actually very helpful because when I reach out to guests and they see that I have a lot of subscribers, they think, oh, okay, he has a lot of reach, so I'm going to come and get interviewed by him. So this would be hugely helpful. Please, I'm asking you to subscribe, and this is very, very helpful for me to get other guests. Back to the interview.
But what was I about to say? Oh yes, for now, what I've noticed with AI, with ChatGPT at least, is that it's quite good at giving me input and having conversations. But the AI give me feedback on what I say, and if I make any mistakes, then point them out and tell me what the right way of saying it is. But I always found that the feedback is always somewhat minimal and very conservative. It's never saying, well, this is wrong, you should say it this way. So, which leads me to think that, well, maybe this is going to get better in the future, but what is to you the importance of getting feedback, specifically from a tutor, from a teacher? Is this a really important aspect of learning?
Yeah, I think it's a really important aspect of learning if you adopt the approach that I referred to before, which is get it right in the end. So get it right in the beginning. In that approach, feedback is less important because you're focusing on accuracy at the beginning. So you're drilling the forms. But if you adopt a get it right at the end approach, which is having conversations and stumbling through them and trying to construct the language as best you can, then feedback becomes a really crucial mechanism for refining and building your resources. I'm trying to say this and I haven't quite said it right, so you get some feedback, which offers you the word that you're looking for. You can drop that in, or it corrects the grammar. You can just quickly put that new grammar into the sentence and try it again. So this is very much part of an approach of get it right in the end. In other words, learn through using the language rather than learn the language and later on use the language with the assumption that your learning will automatically flow into your use. And we know that it doesn't. And again, coming back to Krashen, there's kind of an insight that he had here. He argued that all of that explicit learning feeds into what he refers to as the monitor, but it doesn't feed into your acquired implicit language resources, which you use, which we all use in our first language, to effortlessly communicate and construct meaning. I don't know where that sentence started. I think I kind of lost my way there.
We were talking about the importance of feedback from teachers. Yeah.
So feedback, but of course it has to be applied sensitively and appropriately. The research on feedback suggests that it has to be somewhat intensive around certain features. So it's not like a shotgun where you just where the teacher attacks every single error, but they select certain kinds of errors and are consistent with the feedback on those errors, so that learners' attentional resources are not stretched too thin. So there's a couple of features here the teacher's going to give feedback on. I'm going to get that sort of pretty consistent feedback on those features to help me sort of shape that part of my proficiency, shape it up,
right?
And then it's time to move on to something else. But another point I'd make about feedback is that, and many teachers will have this experience, that they relentlessly give feedback and it seems to make little difference. So there's that issue there, and learners will have the same problem. It's, look, you give me feedback on this, and it doesn't make a difference. And there are various theories that explain this. I think Pieneman's processability theory says that there's not much point giving feedback on linguistic structures that are in advance, too far in advance of the cognitive processes that the learner is able to engage in at a certain point in their learning. So classic one is third person plural S. Now, that's very simple, marking third person plural, right on verbs. And yet, it is one that takes learners a long time to acquire. And they can be quite advanced and still making mistakes in third person plural S. And Pieneman's argument is that actually it's a developmental feature which comes relatively late in a fairly fixed sequence of forms that we acquire in a language. It's a predictable sequence of forms, and that one comes kind of late. So if you give learners feedback on third person plural S and they're just beginning learners, they're not ready to incorporate that structure into their interlanguage. So the feedback might help them with their conscious knowledge about the language. Okay, so I know about this feature, I know about it. As soon as they're put in under communicative pressure, it goes. It's not there because they are not ready to acquire it. They haven't got the cognitive processes, the cognitive linguistic processes in place for that feature to be embedded into their. So feedback, feedback has to be sensitive to those kind of constraints.
I was about to ask actually. This is really interesting because I talk pretty much every day with Japanese speakers, and of course I have to point out some of the mistakes that they make. Not all of them, but I've always been wondering, well, which ones should I really point out? But there's no universal answer. I suppose it depends on their stage of development of the language then.
And it's really hard to know what that stage is. This is not something that you can identify in black and white terms. But you probably develop fairly good intuitions about which features are worth paying attention to and which features are worth giving feedback on or getting feedback on, and which features can be left. And another part of this, of course, is that some features actually it doesn't matter too much for spoken language, at least. So what really matters for spoken language, unless you're in a high stakes context where accuracy is really, really important, but if your use of conversational English is fairly casual, even in a work context, you don't have to be absolutely precise, then don't worry about giving feedback on third person plural S. It doesn't matter. I can still understand you whether you use it or not. If you're and if the learner has got to a point where actually they're quite proficient and they really they have, if you like, this particular form has, coming back to this word, stabilized, or in older terms, fossilized. I really don't like that term. Then the learner may say, it's really time for me in my professional work, using English in my job as a lawyer, say, or a doctor. I really want to start working on fine-tuning some of these parts of my English. Fine. In which case, intensive feedback on that. It might be one part of the suite of ways that a learner is going to, or a user of the language is going to really work on refining that feature. But otherwise, give feedback on the features that really matter for comprehensibility, intelligibility, and pragmatic appropriateness.
Right.
In fact, I think there's research that shows that errors in appropriateness, pragmatics, are judged by native speakers as more serious than errors in pronunciation.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, I remember watching a clip on YouTube with it was an interview of Stephen Krashen where he was talking in part about feedback, and his opinion was that it's just feedback is just useless and all that. But at the same time, I remember listening to this and thinking, well, some of it is not, you're not going to remember it as a learner, but at the same time, my experience has been that I've received feedback even now, even recently, where I apply this when I speak and when I write in English, and this has definitely been effective. So it's not always, maybe I'm not always ready to incorporate it, but I've seen the result.
Yeah, I mean that's really strong anecdotal evidence, but we also have to look to research. And I think, with these questions, we have to be we have to be looking at the research evidence and saying, what is their evidence? What claims does evidence support? And what claims are not supported by evidence? Well, Krashen's claim about feedback is not supported by evidence. There's a substantial body of research now. I suppose it's a good 30 years of research on corrective feedback. It really became popular in the 90s in particular, research looking at the value of corrective feedback. And Roy Lister's work in Canada, among many others, has shown that without doubt that appropriate feedback leads to acquisition. Now, what appropriate means is what forms do you give feedback on? When do you give it? How do you give it? Who gives it? What kind of response is expected? All of these complicated factors feed into whether the feedback is going to work or not. So it is complicated, and there's probably a lot of cases where it doesn't work, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that feedback has a really important, valuable role in pushing language development forwards.
Great. Actually, I do have a last question. It's still very much on the topic of research because it seems to me that, I've actually done some teaching in the past. I've done some language teaching actually, but it was young kids, so it doesn't really count. I mean, listeners may not necessarily be able to relate, but it seems to me talking with teachers, and I have some family members that are teachers as well, language teachers, that there's this whole world of, your research, Paul Nation's research, a lot of research in language teaching and language learning. But teachers are not aware of it. And it's not just that they're not aware of it. When I talk about it with them, I tell them, well, look, I have a YouTube channel and there's all this great information. I'm really surprised that no one knows about this. They're like, oh, yeah, okay. And they're not really interested in the research, and they just keep doing things the way that they've always been done in schools. And so why do you think there's such a gap between the research and,
Well, that's a tough question. I think because the research has not been packaged for teachers often, so it's, people write up research so that other researchers can read it. And they might be researching language classrooms, and they might be researching language teaching and language learning, but they write about it for other researchers. And so the dialogue is functioning outside of what makes sense for teachers. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think also teachers are busy, often overworked, underpaid, and what are they expected to do? Go away and read research? That's a big ask. But that said, when I travel around and I speak to a lot of teachers around Asia, I find teachers really hungry to do things better, to learn about what to do. They haven't got much time though, so they need help. They want that, they're willing to get help, but they need that help to be realistic and practically applicable to their context. So I'll give you an example of one of my PhD students, Jing Yixuan from China, did a wonderful PhD which she completed last year. In fact, it's just been published as a book, and I probably should find the name of the book for you, but I haven't got it with me. She wanted to know about whether task-based language teaching would work in a rural school in a poor part of mainland China. So she went up to the school, and this is, we're talking about the poorest province in China. She went to a school and worked with teachers there, and she found that the teachers were kind of struggling to teach effectively. Teaching in very traditional ways. She said they were teaching in the ways, and Jing is probably a little bit younger than me, but she probably went to school 30 or 40 years ago, and she said that actually they're teaching in the same way that my teachers taught me. So not much had changed. Now she spent a few months or weeks, I think it was a couple of months in that school, working alongside the teachers, talking to them about their teaching, redesigning lesson plans and co-teaching with them, and her thesis tells a wonderful story of how the teachers were so receptive to new ideas and to doing things different. And when they learnt the new ideas, they flourished and the classes went fabulously. And the same with another one of my PhD students looking at teaching in a university in Vietnam. The same thing, that when she observed the teachers teaching from the textbook, the teachers would focus on all the grammar activities, and whenever there was an interactive activity, they would ignore it or just translate it, or just, avoid that. And when she talked to them, and asked them why they did it, they said, well, I don't know. What's the purpose? Why should I get learners to talk to each other? They didn't really understand the value of it. When she workshopped task-based language teaching, explained the value of interaction, how interaction leads to learning, and how you can do these activities. And then she co-planned some lessons and observed them teaching. And she saw, again, a transformation in the quality of engagement and the quality of teaching in those classes. And the difference was the teachers, as you say, they weren't aware of the options that were available to them, or they weren't aware of the theoretical or the principles behind things like interactive activities and the principles of why you do them, but also the principles of how to organize group work. So I think there's a gap there in teacher education. Those two studies show that when teachers are made aware, even if they're underpaid and overworked, they're teachers, they're professionals, they want to do a good job. And certainly those are two studies that show the teaching practice was transformed through awareness raising and knowledge building.
Great, and I hope that my YouTube channel can help with this a little bit. Package this. For example, this interview would be great for someone getting into teaching, definitely. So I hope I can help to bridge the gap a little bit.
Now, well, if anybody wants to contact me about anything I've mentioned here, any of the studies or comments I've made, they're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. I want to be respectful of your time. So this has been really great. I'm sure people have learned a lot, and thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.